Hello everybody, Dr. Jenkins here. This is going to be the video to finish the chapter on thermoregulation. And then if you remember from lecture on Friday, I was trying to find that graph with the hormones and I couldn't find it, but I finally did. So I want to just quickly talk about that as well. But first, let's talk about the end of the thermoregulation chapter. I think I'm going to use red today. Okay. We ended in lecture talking about the two body systems that oversee thermoregulation and fluid balance. And of course, it was the nervous system, and particularly the hypothalamus, acts as the control center in the brain. But we also introduced the fact that the endocrine system, through hormones, is also going to be a way that we can regulate fluid balance and thermoregulation. I give you an example of two hormones: antidiuretic hormone, which is our water-retaining hormone, and aldosterone, which is our salt-retaining hormone. So that's what we finished with. That should be a review. If we continue on in the PowerPoint, there are other things involved in regulating fluid balance and thermoregulation. I'm not going to include this on the test because I think we inherently understand it. But we've already talked about the role that the skin plays. The integumentary system is the system including our skin, because we need the skin to sweat through. And we can only do that, we can only direct fluid to the surface of the skin to sweat with help from the heart and the blood vessels. So these are also playing a role. I'm not going to ask you about these two on the test, but they of course play a role. I give you some examples. Okay. If we talk about acclimatization, I did hit on most of this in lab, which is a good thing. We know that we have the ability to adapt. Your body will make physiological adaptations over time, and we can adapt or acclimate, get used to, quote unquote, temperature and humidity. We can also acclimate to altitude, but we're not going to be discussing that at this point. I give you some information here. I asked you to be able to list two physiological adaptations that make us acclimated. You know, we can just say, oh yeah, with time, you get used to it. Well, what does getting used to it really mean? It means that our body has made changes so that we don't experience the heat the same way and we can better handle it. I love this graph. It's relatively recent. Love it. I asked you just to be able to list two physiological adaptations that occur that make us feel, quote unquote, used to the heat. I gave you two that are easiest. I said earlier onset of sweating and increase in sweating overall. If I was going to pick two that are easiest, what are two of the things that our body adapts to that allows us to acclimate? We sweat sooner and we sweat more. I also talked about this in lab. Make sure you review. Who can thermoregulate better? Adults. Who can thermoregulate better? Men or women? Overall, we're about the same. We tend to do it differently, but overall it appears to be about the same. Who can thermoregulate better? Someone with less body fat or somebody with more body fat? You can thermoregulate, get used to the heat, handle the heat better as someone with less body fat. I give you some information behind the scenes. This is what I talked about in lab anyway, so you can review that. We talked about how long it takes to acclimate. So remember I said for acclimation begins. Acclimatization. Those physiological changes begin at about 48 to 72 hours of exercising or being in a hotter environment. Peak acclimatization is usually 10 days to 2 weeks. So this is the question I posed in lab. If you were traveling in the wintertime from a place like here, from Albany, if you were traveling from here, ideally you'd want to get there at least 2 or 3 days in advance. That's when our body can start to physiologically adapt. But you would ultimately want 2 weeks if you could. I want to just spend a little more time talking about heat illness. This is pretty straightforward. There's a lot more we could go into, but we just don't have the time. So in levels of severity, the least severe form of heat illness would be heat cramps, which could become heat exhaustion, which could become heat stroke. I'm sure everybody that's listening to this has experienced heat cramps. I don't know, maybe yes or no to heat exhaustion. Heat stroke is really serious. So a lot of people will say to me, oh, I've had heat stroke. And I don't know if you really had, because it's life-threatening. So this is the serious stuff, and it's actually a life-threatening emergency. Okay, so let's just identify the basics. I just want you to know the basics. Heat cramps are the least severe forms of a heat illness. As I think in both labs or in lecture, people have asked, is it due to electrolyte imbalances? We think that electrolyte and fluid levels are involved, but it's not necessarily as cut and dry. When we do scientific studies, we purposely hydrate one group and dehydrate the other, and it isn't as cut and dry as to which ones experience heat illness and which ones don't. We're pretty sure that overall fluid and electrolytes are involved, but there seems to be more to it. We have more to learn. How would you handle this? You would remove yourself from the heat and or the humidity, rest, hydrate well, not too much all at once. Don't shove them with 4 bananas at once. Give them a sports drink, have them sip it. Rest. Heat exhaustion would be the next level. This is when we start to have more symptoms. So I'm pointing out what you need to know. With heat illness, we tend to be still sweating. Your skin tends to become more flush or red. And you can also experience some other symptoms. Your pulse will increase, but it'll be harder to feel. You may have a headache. You might be nauseous, dizzy. You might feel lethargic or weak. Similar way to handle it: stop exercising, go to a cool environment, consume fluids slowly. This is definitely something to be worried about. If you're in a big game and you have some heat cramps, you can push through it in many instances, depending on the how, the why, and how bad it is. If we're talking about this, you really want to be careful. So this is a situation where I would remove someone, stop exercising right away. The most severe is heat stroke. As I've said to you, this is life-threatening. One of the symptoms that can be a giveaway is that this person will no longer be sweating. They're beyond the point. This is a life-threatening thing. The body is beginning to shut down. It doesn't have enough fluids. It doesn't have enough resources and energy. In a case like that, where is your body going to purposely choose to put your energy and fluids? Well, of course, it's more important to send those fluids to my core: heart, lungs, kidneys, gut. So when your body is forced to make these changes with whatever fluid and energy it has, it's going to always opt to put that to your core first, which means your body can no longer afford to send that fluid to the skin, and you will stop sweating. This is where we're going to get even a lower drop in blood pressure, weaker pulse, but higher respiratory rate, more central nervous system dysfunction. LOC is loss of consciousness. This is a medical emergency. Usually we don't want to shove fluids in their face right away. We want to first remove them from the situation, cool them down a little before. Small sips, okay, but we usually wait a little. I'm not saying we wait an hour to give them an IV, but we might wait 5 minutes to try and cool them down first, and go from there. So make sure you review those basics. Along with overall fluid imbalances, we can also have an electrolyte imbalance. The most common two would be hyponatremia, low blood sugar, hyperkalemia, high blood potassium. We're going to focus on hyponatremia. This is the number one electrolyte imbalance. Oftentimes, it's going to be happening at the same time as an overall heat stroke. So we're going to focus on this one. Hyponatremia, break the word down. Hypo means less. Na is the symbol for sodium. So this is a condition where you have a lower than usual amount of sodium in the blood. You don't need to know the amount, but it's there if you want. This could be from severe dehydration. So if you have an athlete who's doing something long-term, hours and hours and hours, and they don't hydrate well, or they only hydrate with water, you need to rehydrate with some salt as well. So it's important to hydrate with water and an appropriate amount of salt when needed. But another cause, so one cause of this would be dehydration overall, and the person has only hydrated with water. So they've probably behind the 8 ball with hydrating, but in their attempts to hydrate, they probably only hydrated with water when they should have been hydrating with some water and a little bit of salt. But another cause of hyponatremia, and sometimes, quite frankly, folks, this is a more common cause, overhydration. So these are the two causes. Dehydration, where you've hydrated with some water but not salt. Or overhydration with water. So if I overhydrate with water, this can happen in marathon runners, elite athletes who sometimes are too good at hydrating and they think more is better. Well, if we go on the other end, too much turns out is just as bad. If I am hydrating too much and only with water, it dilutes the sodium. So there may not be a big change in my sodium amount on my body per gram or per whatever the unit is, but the percentage of sodium is significantly lower. You still may have 100 units of sodium. If we just give a fake number, your body, you have 100 units of sodium. That may not change that much. But if I bring in too much water, it dilutes the sodium. So it makes the body feel like instead of having 20% sodium, I've put so much water in with it that now it feels like there's only 15% sodium. Some people just tend to be saltier sweaters than others. Certain people on medication could be more at risk. I talked about this in lecture. You can sometimes notice if you're a salty sweater or if you start to see this white crust, that means you're losing a lot of salt. Treatment, remove from the environment. Don't give fluids right away. Wait 5 minutes or whatever, and then give fluid. Okay, I'm going to end this with a little case study. So I'm not going to ask you to do this on a test, but this happened to me. So the good part of it is that I can show you the actual medical report. And my hope is that some of these things start to make sense to you. This was a long time ago, folks. This was probably my second marathon. This was in Burlington, Vermont. Let me set the stage just a little. It was Burlington, Vermont. it was May. So this is a marathon that happens every Memorial Day. So what had happened was, think about it. When would I have done most of my training for an event in May? In the winter and spring. So I had done a lot of my training outside in the cold. Coming into this, there's a potential, if it's a really hot day, that your body, no matter how much you trained, would not be used to the heat. And that's what happened. On this particular day, it was like 85 degrees. I didn't even know it got that hot in Vermont, especially way up there. So it was unusually hot. I hydrated well. My body just wasn't used to the heat. So, marathon's 26.2 miles. Here I am. That's probably about mile 8 or so. This is quite a long time ago. About mile 20, I noticed I didn't quite feel well, and I had stopped sweating. You know, I know about this stuff, so I know what's happening. But, like many of you, we can be stubborn, and I'm at mile 20, for God's sakes. Do you think I'm going to stop? No, but I should have. As I got closer to the finish line, I remember not being able to run in a straight line. As you get closer to the finish line, they have those temporary little fences along the sidewalk or the road. It also keeps people off the course. And I remember not being able to run straight, and I kind of weaved to the side, and I bumped up against one of the barriers. But at this point, I want to say it was either 24 or mile 25. So I pushed on. I don't remember finishing. So I didn't have a loss of consciousness, but I had severe nervous system dysfunction because I do not remember finishing. Apparently I finished, and they took me to the medical tent. So here's the medical tent, okay? I had told you that what they do is they take your pre-race weight, so that way they may weigh you again at the end of the race to see how much weight you lost, because that could be an indicator of how much fluid you lost. They did not weigh me after. I don't know why, but I think they already knew what was going on. Look at the symptoms. This is a real medical report from the medical tent. Fatigue, lightheaded, weakness. Look at this one. Altered mental status. I told you I passed out. Kind of. I didn't fall to the ground, but I don't remember. They did note that I was better after fluids with my mental status. But look at this, okay? I'm not going to ask you to do this on a test, but I'm just giving you an example of what it might look like. This is after running 26.2 miles. So it's 1 p.m. Look at my blood pressure, 100/60. A normal resting blood pressure is 120/80. When you exercise, that should be higher. I would expect, knowing me, my blood pressure after running that should probably be in the 130s, probably like 135/85. That's where we would expect it to be. But look where it was. My blood pressure was low, which means that I was severely dehydrated. My body just didn't have as much fluid. When there's less fluid in your blood, the blood pressure is less. There's just less pressure from the fluid moving through your vessels. And this is what happens. We have a drop in blood pressure because there's not as many fluids. What's your body going to do to try and make up for that? It's going to increase the amount of times the heart beats per minute, and it's going to increase the respiratory rate. My pulse after finishing a marathon and being taken to the medical tent probably should have been lower than that. My respiratory rate should have definitely been lower than that. But this is the common presentation. The blood pressure is low. How's your body going to try and counteract that? By increasing the heart rate and increasing respiratory rate. You may have less fluid overall, but your body is going to try and pump whatever fluid it has more often as a way to try and make up for it. My temperature, that's pretty high, 101.6. That's pretty high. And then look at my oxygen saturation. We haven't talked about that. A normal oxygen saturation is probably 97 to 100%. 93 may not seem that low, but that's pretty low. And that just has to do with being dehydrated and not having as much oxygen being transported on red blood cells. I'm going to have to blow my nose for one moment. I'm so sorry. Okay. They also, and this is what's cool, they also took my blood right then and there, and they took my sodium. My blood sodium was 138. If you scroll back, hypothetically, in most cases, you're hyponatremic if it's 135 or less. So based on this, I probably wasn't medically hyponatremic, but I was close. However, you know what was abnormal? My potassium. I was hyperkalemic, too much potassium. The normal potassium, 3 to 5. So this is extremely high. They knew that because what did they do? After giving me fluids, IV fluids, they rechecked it. And it was better, it was 5. So what did they do? They gave me fluids, PO means by mouth. And then they gave me some Gatorade. They gave me 1.5 liters of fluid through an IV. And they gave me Zofran. If you know anything about Zofran, it's an anti-nausea medication, because I was indeed throwing up. I gotta tell you, that was the worst I've ever felt, and it lingered. Probably for days after, I was nauseous and kind of felt like a really bad hangover for days. It was not good. All right, folks. To end this off, I want to show you that hormone graph that I couldn't find last Friday in lab. You know where it was all along? Actually, you have access to it. Funny thing, there's so many resources I put out there. Sometimes I forget. So you have access to this. We haven't had a chance to go over it, I don't think. If you look on your lecture Brightspace page under protein, on your lecture Brightspace page under protein, I have put this together because people over the years have been asking me, well, how does muscle grow? So I put this together for extra information. I'm telling you, folks, if you're going into any kind of career, it's sometimes there's so much science, it's hard to find all this information in more simpler terms all in one place. So I encourage you to download this. Keep it. This is all you need to know about how we build muscle, right? So I'm not going to go over all of it. This will not be on any test, anything that I go over here that we haven't had already. But it's a great review of the protein structure. We did talk about protein metabolism in our protein chapter, and we did talk about protein turnover. What we didn't talk about was how it happens, how we build muscle, and the hormones that are involved. This is a great review. Some of this should look familiar. There are a couple added things that I'll point out. Again, you don't need to know this, but if you remember from lecture, we talked about the amino acid pools. Well, this talks about what proteins make up our constant amino acid supply in our blood. The 3 most common, glutamine, glutamate, and alanine, which, by the way, are not the same proteins used to make muscle. So it talks about protein turnover. Okay. It gives you good information on how we build muscle. Exercise is a purposeful stress to the nervous system, to the endocrine system, and to the muscles. So we purposely stress the body to purposely elicit a nervous system, a hormonal, and a muscle response. This is only possible when we have enough amino acids to build the muscle and appropriate rest to give it time to do so. What muscles are used to build what amino acids are used to build muscle? Guess what? The branched chain amino acids that we now know a little bit more about from lab. This talks about where we lay down more protein in the muscle, in the myofibrils, in the sarcomere, and also in the connective tissue around it. I did mention, I think before, mTOR, which is our primary chemical regulator. This is what happens. This talks about how it happens. I have to, give me 1 second here. I'll turn this off. Okay. Our muscles will start to rebuild slowly. So muscle protein synthesis, which is muscle building, slowly increases after exercise. We'll continue to build more muscle within 1 to 2 hours where it'll reach peak. But then, even though we're no longer at peak building, usually we continue to make new muscle up to 24 hours after, which is why we need rest. I talked about the importance of bringing in protein right after exercise for the purpose of what's happening here. This is where I wanted to get to, folks. This is not going to be on a test, but as I was saying in lecture on Friday, I feel like this is not talked about very often, so I really wanted to just get it out there just so you had an idea. It won't be on a test, but all the aforementioned changes in the muscle are not possible without hormones. Right? We talked about exercise is a purposeful stress to the body to purposely cause changes in nervous system, in the muscle, but also to purposely have hormones be released at certain times. Okay. I really think this is probably the best way to do it. Again, I'm not going to ask you this, but with exercise, the goal is to have the right balance of both anabolic or building hormones and catabolic. We need both. Everybody tends to only think about the building, testosterone, growth hormone, IGF-1. But we have to also be able to have catabolic. When we have stress, by the way, isn't exercise a stress to the body? Yes. We have to break down the damaged protein and get it out of the muscle. We have to reduce inflammation. We have to break down energy stores to have energy to later fuel this. So really, we have a series of these hormones being released first as a way to then fuel and support the building. Here are the primary catabolic hormones, and then the anabolic hormones. I go into more about it later, and I realized when I pulled this up, I misspoke a little bit about estrogen in class on Friday. I said that estrogen was not a direct muscle builder, and the reason I said that is because that's what I was always taught. But we haven't really learned a whole lot about estrogen until more recently. So more recently, estrogen has some functions that we're just finding out about. However, never is estrogen the primary driver. So estrogen is not going to be the primary driver. We're going to rely more on growth hormone, IGF-1, insulin, gets converted to a hormone called DHEA, okay. But estrogen is more involved than we thought. So I give you some more information about that. And you can read more about that. This is the last thing I wanted to show you. Now, I will tell you, this is not drawn to scale. This is not drawn to scale. But I wanted to show the overall trends. And that's where, hopefully, this can give you some insight. At the start, again, I'm not going to ask you to do this on a test, but I'm just using it to make a point. At the onset of exercise, we release the most epinephrine and norepinephrine, which gives us energy to the muscles, and also can have some catabolic effects in breaking down stored energy to our muscles. As we exercise longer, we see a slower release of a lot of other chemical hormones, including testosterone. including growth hormone, including IGF-1, which is insulin-like growth factor 1. These two tend to work similarly. So at the onset, we have a quick release of epinephrine, norepinephrine. Then we have a slow build of most of the other anabolic hormones. But look what happens at the end of exercise. Epinephrine and norepinephrine, which went up right at the beginning of exercise, now is going to go down. But here it is at the end of exercise that we start to see the rise. I'll use black. We start to see the rise in cortisol. This is our primary catabolic anti-inflammatory. We want that to go up right away. We like a little bit of anti-inflammatory. However, we don't want too much anti-inflammatory. We want an anti-inflammatory when we need it, but we don't want it to always be there because it'll continue to break down. So we want anti-inflammatory cortisol to be released, do what it does, and then go down. At the same time, as cortisol goes down, that's when we expect to see a sharper rise in testosterone. It's actually something that we can measure. We can measure a testosterone to cortisol ratio. This can be a good indicator of how we are handling the exercise session and recovering. What should the ratio be? Like I said, initially we see an increase in cortisol, but usually that ratio is looking more here, where we expect to see testosterone rising and cortisol going down. The anti-inflammatory cortisol did its thing, and now at the tail end of that, testosterone and the others will go up a little bit too to build that muscle back. So I just wanted to give this to you as an idea, just so you had it, but it won't be on the test. All right, good stuff, folks. Please go back under protein on your Brightspace lecture page and download this, save it, cherish it, learn. All right, talk to you later, folks.